Hello, physiologists. Let's talk about some respiratory disorders and the nervous control of breathing. So, you have respiratory centers located in your brainstem, especially in the medulla oblongata, and the pons. You've got medullary rhythmicity area, and you have a pneumotaxic area. And the job of the respiratory center is to make sure that the respiratory effort matches your metabolic demands. So basically, that means you're breathing enough and moving enough oxygen and carbon dioxide to match the needs of your body. It needs to get rid of all the carbon dioxide that's produced and bring in enough oxygen for your cells to use. And you have receptors that send motor output to regulate the breathing. So your respiratory centers regulate this. They get input from chemoreceptors that monitor your carbon dioxide levels, your pH, and so forth, and then this helps to regulate your breathing. You do have some neural reflexes that can adjust your breathing very quickly. The chemoreceptor reflex, those chemoreceptors will monitor your pH, your carbon dioxide, and your oxygen, but the most important stimulus that's going to affect your breathing rate is carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide continues to increase and increase and increase, the urge to breathe becomes overwhelming, which is why, although toddlers may protest and be very upset and they'll be very mad and they'll say, "I'm going to hold my breath until I die," they actually can't. They might be able to hold their breath long enough for them to pass out, but then their reflexes will take over and they'll be forced to take in a breath, as long as, of course, nothing is obstructing that airway. And that's actually the stimulus that is involved in why we breathe in. You have carbon dioxide that raises to a certain level, and then that causes our respiratory centers to stimulate our diaphragm and cause us to inhale. And then on our next exhale, we get rid of some of that CO2. So you would think it'd be oxygen, but it's actually carbon dioxide that's the most important stimulus that affects your breathing rate and depth. Proprioreceptors are found in your muscles and your joints, and these basically tell your respiratory center when are you moving your body. So if you get on a treadmill, for example, or you're playing soccer outside and you start moving around a lot, those proprioreceptors give that information to your respiratory center and says, "Hey, my body is moving around a whole lot. We are going to be generating some more CO2 soon. We're going to be needing some more oxygen soon. Let's increase our respiratory depth and respiratory rate." Your inhalation reflex just helps you to prevent overstretching in your lungs. You can inhale to a certain point, but when you stretch your lungs to a certain point, you actually inhibit the inhale, and that prevents overstretching due to overinflation. So you have a couple of reflexes that help to regulate your breathing depth and breathing rate. And so here are some images of a couple of different things that go into regulating that. So here are your brainstem centers located in your medulla and your pons. Here are those stretch receptors. So if you stretch your lungs too much, that will inhibit your breathing. If you have certain irritants that are present in your lungs, that can also inhibit your breathing. You have higher brain centers such as your cerebral cortex. So even if you were just thinking about how you're about to get on a treadmill and exercise, for example, that is going to send information to your pons and medulla. Other receptors, such as pain, emotional stimuli, if you're very stressed out about something, it's common for hyperventilation and some of those things to happen. So you can adjust your breathing rate based on emotional stimuli that go through the hypothalamus. And then that information also is sent to your respiratory centers. And then, of course, the main ones. You've got chemoreceptors, both peripheral and central chemoreceptors, that are constantly monitoring your CO2 and pH levels. Some of them also monitor oxygen levels. And then the proprioreceptors located in your muscles and joints are sending information. And all of this information goes to your respiratory center, and then it can put it all together and decide, do we need to increase or decrease our respiratory depth and rate? What is the body's demand? How can we meet that? When you look at the types of muscle that you have to control in your respiratory system, you have two different types. You have your breathing muscles, which are composed of skeletal muscle. So these are voluntary muscles. You have control over them. They're innervated by the somatic nervous system, and these are controlled by your brainstem as well as your cerebral cortex. So the brainstem, those respiratory centers, are responsible for making sure that you breathe while you're asleep or while you're unconscious. But your cerebral cortex also you have voluntary control over it. So you can think to yourself, I'm going to take in a deep breath now. And you do it because you have voluntary control over those skeletal muscles. Your diaphragm, your external intercostals, additional accessory respiratory muscles, you have control over that. But at the same time, your brainstem takes over when you go to sleep, so you don't have to worry about dying due to buildup of carbon dioxide and lack of oxygen while you sleep. In other parts of your respiratory system, you have smooth muscle, especially when we start looking at your bronchioles. These are strictly innervated by your autonomic nervous system, and they are controlled by the rhythmic output from your phrenic and intercostal nerves. So if you have changes in sensory input, that'll be what causes it. So your breathing can be controlled both consciously, you have some control over it, as well as reflexively, thanks to your brainstem and your autonomic nervous system. Let's move on to a couple of disorders. So hyperventilation, hyper means above or more. Hyperventilation is when you increase your breathing rate or depth above and beyond the body's demand. So if you have plenty of oxygen in your blood, you don't have that much carbon dioxide, and you are still breathing hard, if you are breathing either faster than normal or increased depth than normal, you're breathing more deeply, then that would be hyperventilation. It's above and beyond what your body needs. So if you're running around and running really hard and you're generating a lot of CO2 and you're exercising and you need more oxygen, that's still not hyperventilation. This is abnormal. This is above and beyond what your body demands. So when you hyperventilate, you're bringing in more oxygen into your alveoli and you're moving out more carbon dioxide. And that makes sense. If you're breathing more deeply or faster, you're going to move those gases more. However, your hemoglobin is great at grabbing oxygen. And so even though you're bringing more oxygen into your alveoli, you're really not going to load that much more into your blood, because if you're breathing normally, your hemoglobin is already pretty close to saturated. Hyperventilation will increase how much oxygen you have, but not really that much. You do, however, have extra carbon dioxide that leaves the blood. This is going to adjust your blood pH. And so if you remember from the equation that's shown at the bottom, remember carbon dioxide combines with water, and then it can dissociate into carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid can dissociate into hydrogen ions. This is what causes this is the acid. This is what will lower the pH. And then bicarbonate ion. Notice that these arrows are reversible. So you can also have bicarbonate ion and your hydrogen combine to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can then dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. The direction that these arrows go depends on your reactants. If you are exhaling a lot of carbon dioxide, you have fewer reactants on the left side, and you have more reactants on the right side. So that means the equation is going to be moved to the left. If you're getting rid of all of your CO2, I think of this as kind of a seesaw. Fewer reactants over here on the left, more reactants over here on the right. So the equation is going to move toward the left. So as you move out more carbon dioxide, you are going to get rid of more of this hydrogen ion. So as this hydrogen ion combines and everything shifts to the left, as you get rid of the hydrogen ion, I kind of think of that as getting rid of the acid. And so what happens is respiratory alkalosis. Your blood becomes more basic because this acid right here is combining with your bicarbonate and moving the equation to the left, and you keep exhaling and getting rid of the CO2. So hyperventilation can cause respiratory alkalosis, where your blood pH increases or becomes more basic. In addition, as a result of that hypocapnia, hypo means below, capnia is referring to carbon dioxide. If you have low levels of CO2, that also is going to cause bronchoconstriction, and it is also going to decrease oxygen delivery. Now, if you're hyperventilating, you're pretty good on oxygen anyways, most likely. So hyperventilation leads to respiratory alkalosis. Hypoventilation does the opposite. So hypoventilation is very slow or shallow breathing. This may be due, you can do this yourself, just holding your breath, you're hypoventilating. But more commonly, it can be due to airway obstruction. It can be due to pneumonia, if you have liquid in your lungs. Brainstem injury that adjusts your medulla or your pons, those respiratory centers, due to obesity. There are several different things that can cause hypoventilation. In hypoventilation, you are not getting as much oxygen into your alveoli. And you are seeing an increase in your carbon dioxide levels. And so, too little oxygen is hypoxia, and too much carbon dioxide is hypercapnia. And what happens is respiratory acidosis, and it's because, again, through this equation. So this is the exact same equation that we just saw. Carbon dioxide plus water can turn into carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So if you have an increase in your CO2 levels because you can't get it out of your lungs, maybe you have an airway obstruction. If you cannot move your CO2 out of your body, then it will build up in your lungs. You've got plenty of water, so this equation moves to the right. And the more trouble that you have moving that air, the more and more CO2 you'll have build up. And so when I think of this as our seesaw again, you have a lot more reactants on the left side of this equation and fewer on the right side. So the equation moves to the right. As you have more CO2 build up, the equation moves to the right, and you're going to be generating more hydrogen ions. More hydrogen ions means more acidity, which means lower pH. So you can get respiratory acidosis due to high carbon dioxide levels. When you're exercising, you may notice that you start breathing more deeply, and you may also start breathing faster. Although it's an interesting experiment, if you start exercising, start doing some jumping jacks or climb some stairs, take note to which one goes first. Do you start breathing more deeply first, or do you start breathing more quickly first? And you'll notice that you start breathing more deeply first. You start increasing the depths of your breaths first, and then as you need an increased respiratory effort, you increase the rate as well after that. While you're exercising, you're consuming a lot of oxygen. Oxygen is used to generate ATP in your cells, and you also produce a lot of carbon dioxide as just a metabolic waste product. When you're finished exercising, you'll notice that your breathing kind of slows down gradually. You don't just all of a sudden go back to normal breathing, and that just helps your blood chemistry to return to normal. As you breathe out, you move more carbon dioxide, and you're also moving, you're also bringing more oxygen in to replenish any resources that were diminished. Smoking is a difficult topic because of the nicotine aspect to it. Nicotine does some work on your receptors. You downregulate your nicotine receptors, and which makes it very, very difficult to quit because your body stops producing its own neurotransmitters that can bind to those nicotine receptors because you have been supplying the nicotine for whatever period of time through cigarettes or through nicotine patches or whatever. But even though it can be difficult to quit, it's really in your best interest. And this is because smoking really decreases your respiratory efficiency. The nicotine causes your terminal bronchioles to constrict, which limits how much air you can move into your lungs. Carbon monoxide is in part of the smoke, and it binds to hemoglobin. And carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin more strongly than oxygen, too. So you don't have respiratory effectiveness that way. There are many, many irritants in smoke, including carcinogens, but even the other irritants in the smoke will increase your mucus secretion, which helps to impede the airflow so that you, again, are not moving as much oxygen in or as much carbon dioxide out. The irritants also inhibit cilia movement, and they destroy the cilia. And so normally the cilia that are located in your respiratory tract are used to flush any debris, any microorganisms, mucus. It helps to move everything toward your pharynx so that you can either cough it out or you can swallow it down your esophagus. But since the cilia don't work anymore or they're destroyed, the only thing you can do is to cough things out the best you can. And so that's where a smoker's cough comes from. It's because the cilia are not working anymore. You also destroy the elastic fibers in your lungs, and this is the main reason why most smokers at some point will get emphysema if they smoke for long enough. Lung cancer obviously is associated with smoking, but for those who don't get lung cancer and those who do, you're most likely going to get emphysema. With emphysema, you destroy the respiratory membrane, you increase resistance, and you will not be able to move as much oxygen in or carbon dioxide out. So it's very, very difficult to quit smoking. I will not argue that, but it is definitely worth the time and worth the effort to quit. COPD, as it's commonly called, stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. And so just some examples of these: emphysema, chronic bronchitis, asthma are a few. Emphysema, as we just talked about, results in destruction of the alveolar membrane, reducing your respiratory membrane. Chronic bronchitis is inflammation of your bronchioles for a long time. That's chronic. Asthma causes sporadic constriction of your bronchioles too. So all of these decrease airflow. Coughing and frequent pulmonary infections. Dyspnea, which is difficult breathing. Hypoventilation. So these are all associated with as chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. And so you can see some of the results of a couple of these. So if you have a lot of tobacco smoke, or if you're in an area with a lot of air pollution, this can irritate your bronchioles. It can cause inflammation, which causes bronchitis. You get a lot of mucus production. You have a productive cough, which means you're constantly coughing up junk out of your lungs. With emphysema, you have elastin breakdown. Your lungs are not as elastic, and they don't stretch and recoil as much as normal. Those alveolar walls are also destroyed, like we talked about. Both of these result in airway obstruction or air trapping, dyspnea, which is difficult or labored breathing, and frequent infections. With infections, you often have inflammation that results, which is another problem with breathing, because you don't want that respiratory membrane to be thickened anymore. And then these can lead to hypoventilation, where you cannot move as much gas, you don't bring as much oxygen in, you don't move as much carbon dioxide out. Hypoxemia is low oxygen levels. And then we discussed how hypoventilation can lead to respiratory acidosis. Again, you're not moving as much carbon dioxide out, it stays in your lungs. That moves that equation to the right, so you generate more hydrogen ion. Hope this helped you understand some of the neural controls and some respiratory disorders.